Imagine walking down like a really bustling city street, right? And half the people you pass are legally considered property.
Right.
But at the exact same time, any one of those people could potentially buy their freedom and, I mean, within a single generation, become wealthier and more influential than the city's mayor.
Oh, yeah, easily.
And then you walk a few blocks further and you're marveling at these massive aqueducts delivering millions of gallons of fresh water, public baths with actual underfloor heating, and this highly sophisticated fiat currency system.
Hmm.
And then, you turn the corner and you just sit down with 50,000 other people to casually watch an untrained convict get literally torn apart by wild animals, like as a form of theatrical lunchtime entertainment.
It is, it's a profound paradox. You're
Yeah.
looking at a society operating at the absolute zenith of ancient civic engineering and like administrative brilliance, running simultaneously alongside what we would definitely consider visceral, institutionalized brutality.
Yeah. And that is exactly the paradox we are taking on today. Welcome to the deep dive. We're looking directly at the massive stack of sources you sent our way. Articles, archaeological reports, economic analyses, all focused on trying to really decode the Roman Empire.
Yes, it's a huge pile of material.
It really is. But our mission today isn't to just, recite a timeline of mad emperors or list off a bunch of battles. We are going to deconstruct this empire as a living, breathing, profoundly complex system. Like, how did they hold a society of this staggering scale together for centuries? And what was it actually like for an average person to just wake up, go to work, and survive inside of it?
Well, to even begin answering that, we have to establish the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of the material you've shared with us. We are looking at a political entity that started as a republic, but fundamentally transformed into an empire when Octavian, who later took the title Augustus, established the Principate in 27 BC. From that moment, the expansion is just staggering. If we fast forward to its territorial peak under the Emperor Trajan around 117 AD, the Roman Empire encompassed roughly 5 million square kilometers.
I mean, I was trying to visualize that exact number from the sources. 5 million square kilometers. You're talking about a continuous landmass stretching from, like, the freezing, drizzle-soaked moors of northern England all the way down through Europe, across North Africa, and right up to the sun-baked banks of the Euphrates River in Syria.
Exactly. And within those borders lived an incredibly diverse population. Modern demographic studies estimate the population was anywhere between 55 and 60 million people, with some historians arguing it could have been as high as 100 million at its absolute zenith.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, we are talking about roughly 1/6 to 1/4 of the entire human population on Earth at that time, all living under one central administrative umbrella.
Which survived in the West until roughly 476 AD, and in the East, what we call the Byzantine Empire, for another 1,000 years until 1453.
Right, yeah.
It's a lifespan that just completely defies modern political logic. The Romans completely encircled the Mediterranean Sea. They literally called it Mar Nostrum, which translates to our sea. They essentially turned the entire Mediterranean into a private Roman lake.
They did. And that geographic reality is, well, it's the foundation of their entire system. Because when you look at the raw numbers, a glaring logistical problem emerges immediately. The Romans completely lacked the sheer manpower to rule a territory of 5 million square kilometers, containing up to 100 million people, through brute military force alone.
Yeah, you just can't.
You simply cannot physically station enough soldiers in every single village from Spain to Egypt to suppress that many people by the sword. It would bankrupt the state in a decade.
I was actually wrestling with this while reading the economic data you provided. The best way I could wrap my head around it is to view the Roman Empire like a massive, ancient, multinational corporation.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Like, you have the CEO, the emperor, sitting in the global headquarters in Rome, but you're trying to run this sprawling corporate empire before the invention of the internet, before telephones, before even the printing press or fast transportation. A message takes weeks to cross the sea. So, how on earth do you keep the regional branch managers in Britannia or North Africa loyal to the CEO in Rome?
Exactly. What stops them from just breaking off?
Yeah. What stops a governor in Egypt from just hoarding all the grain, keeping the profits, and starting his own competing country?
Well, what's fascinating here is that corporate analogy is highly accurate. And the Roman solution to that exact management problem was just breathtakingly pragmatic. They realized that micromanagement from a distance is impossible. So they operated a remarkably lean central government. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the central bureaucracy in Rome only sent out about 160 senior officials annually to govern the entire world outside of Italy.
Wait. I saw that number in the documents and thought it had to be a typo. 160 officials to manage up to 100 million people? How does that math possibly work?
It works through a brilliant mechanism we can basically call co-opting the local elites. When Romans conquered or annexed a new territory, the primary mission of the legions quickly shifted from active warfare to policing and administration. But they didn't arrive and try to replace every local mayor and magistrate with a Roman bureaucrat. Instead, they relied on a concept known as mos regionis.
Most regions.
Right, which means respecting the custom of the region.
So they didn't force everyone to instantly adopt Roman law for every little local dispute.
Not at all. If a local community demonstrated baseline loyalty to Rome, the Romans offered the existing tribal leaders or city councils a highly lucrative deal. They essentially said, look, you can keep your local power, you can keep your local religious customs, you can even collect the taxes yourself.
What?
But in exchange, you must keep the peace. You must provide us with our cut of the tax revenue, and you must acknowledge the ultimate overarching authority of the emperor in Rome.
They franchised the empire. I mean, they made the local elites shareholders in the business of Roman stability.
That is the exact mechanism. It was a system that provided legal privileges and relative independence as a reward for compliance. The local elites quickly realized that cooperating with Rome was the absolute best, easiest way to maintain their own wealth and status. I mean, why fight a bloody rebellion and risk crucifixion when you can just collect taxes for Rome and keep a portion to build yourself a massive villa?
It's minimum viable bureaucracy. But, as smart as that carrot is, you still need a stick. Which brings us to the military. The sources you gave us note the army was around 300,000 to 400,000 men during the imperial period. Again, for an empire of up to 100 million people, that actually seems dangerously small. Like, that's barely a police force.
It is remarkably small. It represented no more than perhaps 2% of the adult males living in the empire. But what the Roman military lacked in sheer percentage, it made up for in extreme, unyielding professionalization. After the Punic Wars and the turmoil of the late Republic, the Roman military completely transitioned away from being a militia of conscripted farmers who fought for a summer and then went home to harvest crops.
Right.
It became a full-time, lifelong career. You volunteer for 20 years of active duty and then 5 years as a reserve.
And reading through the daily logs of these soldiers, they weren't just guys standing around with swords waiting for a battle. They were the premier builders, engineers, and administrators of the ancient world. They built the roads, the aqueducts, the frontier walls.
They were the physical infrastructure of the state. Their primary mission was to preserve the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But beyond fighting, the military was the ultimate engine of assimilation. The Romans had a mechanism for turning conquered enemies into loyal citizens, and we see this most clearly when we look at the auxiliaries.
Right, the auxilia. Because the standard legions were made up strictly of Roman citizens. But the auxiliaries were recruited from the non-citizens, the provincial subjects, the recently conquered peoples, and they made up roughly half of the entire army, correct?
Yes, around 125,000 to 150,000 men at various points. And here is the genius of the incentive structure the Romans created. These non-citizens, these provincial men, would volunteer to fight for Rome. They were paid less than the citizen legionaries, and the term of service was grueling. 25 years.
That's a lifetime.
It really is. But if they survived that 25-year term, they received a military diploma. Their reward was full Roman citizenship. And crucially, that citizenship was also granted to their children and all their descendants.
That basically blows my mind. You take the most aggressive, capable, potentially rebellious young men from a recently conquered territory like Gaul or Germania. You give them a job, a steady paycheck, and the ironclad promise that their children will be full, equal shareholders in the empire. You are literally manufacturing loyal Romans out of your former enemies.
It was a machine for generating loyalty. And consider how this works geographically. While these auxiliary soldiers are serving their 25 years, they are stationed in garrisons, often far from their home provinces.
Right.
A garrison needs food, leather, iron, entertainment. So local merchants set up shop outside the fort. This civilian settlement, called a vicus, slowly grows into a town. The soldiers have money to spend, so they inject silver into the local economy. They intermarry with local women. They conduct their business in Latin. Over a generation, that entire frontier zone becomes naturally integrated into the Roman world.
It just happens organically.
Exactly. It wasn't forced cultural assimilation at sword point. It was assimilation through overwhelming economic and social gravity.
Which brings up the economy. Because this entire system, paying 400,000 professional soldiers, co-opting elites, building roads, it requires massive amounts of money. But one of the most surprising facts in this entire stack of sources is the tax rate. How does a massive continental empire function when the average tax burden was only around 5% of the gross domestic product?
The low tax rate is exactly why the system functioned, actually. A typical individual tax rate ranged from 2 to 5%. There were poll taxes, a flat tax on individuals' land taxes, and indirect taxes like customs duties and tolls. But overall, compared to modern states or even some contemporary ancient empires, the burden on the provincial civilian was remarkably light.
But how? I mean, if the taxes are that low, how is the emperor paying for everything?
Because the state had very few expenses outside of the military and the grain dole in Rome. They didn't have public education systems, state pensions, or massive health departments to fund. By keeping taxes low, they allowed local agricultural and merchant economies to organically grow. And crucially, the low tax rate allowed those co-opted local elites to accumulate massive personal wealth.
Right back to the branch managers. If the taxes are low, the local elites can extract their own wealth from the peasantry, get incredibly rich, and remain perfectly happy and loyal to the CEO in Rome. It is a stunningly pragmatic, almost cold-blooded machine.
It is. But this vast, efficient state machinery created a highly specific environment for the millions of people actually living inside of it. Because once you establish this continent-spanning peace and you establish the rules of the game, human beings are going to figure out how to navigate it and climb the ladder.
And that reality shatters so many modern assumptions we have about antiquity. When we think of the ancient world, we usually picture societies that are rigidly patriarchal, totally static, where, you're born a peasant and you die a peasant. But looking at the social fluidity in Rome, it's jarring. Let's look at the women of Rome, for example. Freeborn Roman women possessed a level of financial independence that is honestly shocking, and frankly, a level of legal autonomy we don't really see again in Europe for over 1,000 years.
It is a truly remarkable aspect of Roman jurisprudence. In the very early days of the Republic, there was an archaic form of marriage known as manus. In a manus marriage, a woman was legally handed over from her father's authority into the absolute legal authority of her husband. But by the time we reach the imperial era we're discussing, manus marriage had largely faded into obscurity.
So what did the new standard marriage look like for a woman's day-to-day life?
It was essentially a free marriage. It meant that a married woman retained absolute ownership of any property she brought into the marriage. Her husband had no legal right to touch her money or her estates. She kept her own family name for her entire life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. She could independently enter into business contracts, she could buy and sell land, and she could set the terms of her own will without her husband's permission. Technically, under Roman law, she remained under her father's legal authority, the paterfamilias, even after she moved into her husband's house.
But the sources point out the critical loophole here. When her father died, she didn't pass into her husband's control. She became legally emancipated.
Correct. She became sui juris, legally independent. Let's say we have a Roman woman named Julia. Her father passes away. Suddenly, Julia is completely free of direct male legal scrutiny in her daily financial life. If she inherited a villa and a farm, she managed the accounts. This gave Roman women enormous societal influence, especially over their own grown sons, because the mother controlled her own wealth and decided who received it in her will.
And further adding to the sense of social fluidity, divorce carried very little moral stigma. If Julia wanted out of the marriage, the process was straightforward, and speedy remarriage after being widowed or divorced was entirely common and expected.
But we must tread carefully here because there is always a dark, heavy counterweight in Roman history. At the exact same time we are examining this surprisingly progressive financial independence for freeborn women, we must also examine the foundation it was built upon. Rome was a truly brutal, institutionalized slave society.
The numbers in the economic data are horrifying. At the time of Augustus, historians estimate that as much as 35% of the population of Roman Italy were enslaved. Over a third of the human beings you pass on the street in the heart of the empire are legally classified as property.
It is one of the most difficult, unpalatable realities of Rome for a modern person to reconcile. Sociologists classify Rome as one of the few genuine slave societies in human history. meaning a society where slaves constituted at least a fifth of the population and played an absolute, irreplaceable role in the core economic engine.
Right.
They were the muscle of the agricultural estates, the fatal labor in the deep mines, and the domestic workforce in the cities. The legal baseline was terrifyingly simple. A slave had no legal personhood. They could be subjected to corporal punishment, sexual exploitation, and lethal torture without legal recourse.
But the sources also emphasize a distinction that we really need to clarify because it differs so heavily from the transatlantic slave trade we are more familiar with in recent history. Roman slavery was not based on race.
That is a vital distinction for understanding their social structure. The enslaved people in Italy were often indigenous Italians who had fallen into debt, or war captives from absolutely anywhere the legions had marched. Gaul, Greece, North Africa, the Middle East, Britannia. You could also become a slave through infant abandonment, which was tragically common. So slavery in Rome was a legal and social status, an awful stroke of fortune, but it was not an ideology tied to skin color or ethnic origin.
And this is where the Roman concept of social mobility comes roaring back in a way that feels almost completely contradictory. Because unlike many other slave systems, a Roman slave could actually engage in capitalism and buy their way out. Walk me through how this peculium system actually functioned.
It requires us to understand how embedded slaves were in the urban economy. While the conditions for slaves working in the agricultural fields or the silver mines were essentially a slow death sentence, urban slaves had a very different trajectory. They often worked as teachers, physicians, accountants, or business managers for their owners. And if a slave was conducting business, say, running a bakery or a merchant ship for their master, the master might grant them a peculium.
It's essentially a legally protected side hustle fund.
Precisely. The peculium was a fund of money or property that the slave is allowed to manage and grow as if it were their own, even though technically it still belonged to the master. A talented entrepreneurial slave could use this fund to trade, invest, and accumulate a massive amount of wealth. Eventually, they could accumulate a large enough peculium to literally buy their own freedom, paying their master a lump sum that offset the master's loss of their future labor.
Or, the sources show that masters would routinely free their slaves in their wills as a reward for loyal service, a legal process called manumission. And this wasn't a rare once-in-a-generation event. It was happening constantly.
It was happening at such a staggering rate that it actually caused a demographic panic among the elite. Manumission became so incredibly common that the Roman government had to step in and pass a law, the Lex Sufia Cania, to strictly limit the percentage of slaves an owner was legally allowed to free in his will.
That completely breaks my brain.
Yeah.
They had an economy totally reliant on millions of slaves, but the cultural practice of freeing them was so deeply ingrained that the government had to pass a law saying, whoa, stop freeing everybody. We need people to keep working.
Yeah, it's wild.
And the most fascinating part is what happens the day after they are freed. They didn't just become second-class invisible ghosts, they became freedmen, and their children were born as full, free Roman citizens.
And this rapid upward mobility became a source of intense anxiety for the old aristocratic Roman families, because these freedmen often had decades of hardcore business experience running their former masters' commercial enterprises. Once freed, they dominated trade and commerce. By the 1st century AD, it was not unusual to find a former slave who was financially richer and practically more influential than a freeborn senator whose family had been in Rome for 500 years.
Okay, I have to pause here because this leads to a massive contradiction in the timeline. We have this incredibly fluid society. Women have financial rights, slaves can hustle, buy their freedom, become millionaires. And then we hit the year 212 AD. The Emperor Caracalla issues an edict called the Constitutio Antoniana. And this edict grants universal citizenship to all freeborn inhabitants of the entire empire. Everyone from Britannia to Syria is suddenly a Roman citizen. On paper, it looks like the ultimate triumph of equality, right? But the sources show that immediately after this, the elites just turn around and create a brutal two-tier justice system. Why?
To understand the why, we have to look at the mechanism of human sociology and, frankly, elite self-preservation. Think about the old Roman elite, the senators, the equestrians. For centuries, their entire sense of superiority was anchored in holding the exclusive, legally protected status of Roman citizen.
But then Caracalla gives that title away to everyone. Why did he do it?
Primarily for tax purposes. Roman citizens paid an inheritance tax that non-citizens didn't. By making everyone a citizen, Caracalla massively expanded the tax base to pay the military.
Ah, of course. Always about paying the military.
Exactly, but sociologically, this created a crisis for the upper classes. When formal, traditional hierarchies blur, when a freed slave is richer than you and now every peasant in Gaul holds the exact same legal title of citizen that you do, the elite will inevitably seek a new framework to affirm their superiority. If the word citizen no longer protects them, they invent new legal categories.
And that's where we get the split between the honestiores and the humiliores.
Exactly. The justice system informally and then legally splits. The honestiores were the honorable ones, the wealthy elite, the senators, the military officers. The humiliores were the humble ones, the vast, vast majority of the newly minted citizen masses.
So, equality on paper led to horrific inequality in practice. Walk me through how this actually looked in a courtroom. Let's say an honestiore, like a rich merchant, and a humilior, a poor baker, commit the exact same crime. Let's say they both forge a document. What happens?
The outcomes would be radically, violently different. If the honestiore was found guilty of forgery, the magistrate would consider his dignitas, his social worth. He might be ordered to pay a hefty fine or perhaps face a comfortable exile to a pleasant island. He was legally immune from torture during interrogation and immune from corporal punishment.
Must be nice.
Right. Now, if the humilior was found guilty of the exact same forgery, his body was entirely at the disposal of the state. He could be brutally beaten. He could be sentenced to lethal labor in the mines. Or, for severe crimes, he could be subjected to the torturous theatrical executions previously reserved strictly for slaves, like crucifixion or being condemned to the beasts in the arena.
That is chilling. The elite essentially realized they couldn't hoard the title of citizen anymore, so they just hoarded the right to not be tortured. And this stark physical divide between the VIPs and the humble masses wasn't just happening in the courtroom. It completely dictated the physical spaces they lived in and the economic engine that kept them alive.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's shift to the daily grind of this society. Let's look at the Roman economy. Because reading through the financial data, it's astonishingly dynamic. You have goods moving from Britain to Egypt. But how did they actually facilitate trade on that massive scale without modern banking?
The mechanism that made it all possible was a highly monetized network, facilitated by a practical three-tier fiat currency system established by Augustus.
Let's define fiat quickly for everyone. A fiat currency means the money has value primarily because the government decrees it has value, not necessarily because the metal itself is worth that exact amount.
Correct. The Roman system was brilliant in its standardization. For major land purchases, hoarding wealth, or massive state transactions, you had the gold aureus. For the middle class, for paying the soldiers and for paying taxes, you had the silver denarius. And then for the everyday, bustling street economy, buying a cup of wine, a loaf of bread, or entry to the baths, you had the brass sestertius and the copper ass.
But how does a single currency actually integrate a market across 5 million square kilometers?
By standardizing trust. The genius of the Roman system, especially with the lower value bronze and brass coins, was that they circulated by face value rather than their strict metal weight. A merchant didn't have to bite the coin or weigh it on a scale to see if he was being cheated. Romans counted their coins, they didn't weigh them. This meant a merchant in Syria could confidently sell glassware to a buyer in Roman Britain, knowing the denarius he received was standard, guaranteed by the emperor's face stamped on it.
But to mint millions and millions of these coins to keep an economy of 100 million people moving, they needed an unimaginable amount of precious metal. And the scale of Roman mining operations, the sources describe it as proto-industrial. They were using a technique called hydraulic mining. How does that actually work?
The Romans called it ruina montium, literally the ruin of mountains. It's a technique later known as hushing or ground sluicing. The Romans would find a mountain in Spain or Britain that contained deep veins of gold or silver. Instead of just digging tiny shacks, they would build massive aqueducts to transport millions of gallons of water from higher elevations into huge reservoirs built directly above the mining site.
And then they just pull the plug.
They would release the water all at once in a catastrophic engineered flash flood. The sheer kinetic force of the water would blast away the topsoil, strip the vegetation, and literally wash away the side of the mountain, exposing the gold-bearing bedrock. They would then use fire setting, heating the rock with massive fires, and then dousing it with cold water to shatter it before washing the debris away again.
It is absolute environmental devastation in the pursuit of economic growth, and the scale of this was completely unmatched.
Unmatched until the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. The total annual iron output is estimated at over 80,000 tons. And we actually have physical, irrefutable geological proof of the scale of their lead and silver smelting today.
You're talking about the Greenland ice sheet data.
Yes. As snow falls over millennia in Greenland, it traps the atmospheric conditions of that specific year in a layer of ice. If you take a deep ice core sample, you can track global pollution year by year. During the Roman imperial era, the amount of lead pollution trapped in the Greenland ice sheet quadruples over prehistoric levels. The Romans were literally altering the global atmosphere with their industrial exhaust. The pollution levels only drop back down centuries later when the empire's economy collapses.
That is wild to think about. Roman smog reaching the Arctic. So you have all this newly minted wealth, all this trade moving along 50,000 miles of advanced Roman roads. Where does the money flow? It flows into the cities. But living in a Roman city was a dramatically different sensory experience depending on whether you were a wealthy, honest shearer or a poor humiliator.
Urban life was the beating heart of Roman culture. But we have to be realistic about ancient urban ecology. Cities were fundamentally what historians call demographic sinks.
Meaning that more people died in the city every year than were born in it.
Exactly. When you pack hundreds of thousands of people into a dense urban grid without modern germ theory or modern sanitation, disease is rampant. The average life expectancy at birth was somewhere in the mid-20s, heavily skewed by the fact that perhaps half of all children died before reaching adulthood. The cities required constant, massive immigration from the countryside just to maintain their population levels. And Rome itself grew to an astonishing size, an estimated 1 million people.
1 million people in antiquity. But how those 1 million people lived is the ultimate tale of two cities. Let's walk through the physical space. If you were rich, you lived in a domus.
A domus was a spacious, privately owned single-family townhouse. It was designed from the ground up to be visible, impressive, and a tool for social dominance. When you entered, you stepped into an atrium, a grand, open reception hall with a skylight. This is where the wealthy patron would meet his clients every morning. The home would have private, piped-in water, beautiful frescoes, and typically a gorgeous, enclosed peristyle garden in the back. It was a haven of light, fresh air, and quiet.
But if you were a part of the 95%, the humble masses, the humiliores, you were crammed into a structure called an insula. And the translation is island, but it's essentially a massive multi-story apartment block. But I really want to stress to you listening, do not picture a modern brick-exposed loft apartment. Picture a squalid, dark, overcrowded fire trap.
The architecture of inequality was built vertically. Unlike modern penthouses, the higher up you lived in a Roman insula, the poorer you were and the more dangerous your life was. The ground floors were often shops or relatively sturdy apartments for the middle class. But as you climbed the rickety wooden stairs to the fourth, fifth, or even sixth floors, the construction became increasingly shoddy, prone to collapsing, and brutally hot in the summer. And crucially, most of these upper floor apartments completely lacked kitchens.
Because if you have a cooking fire in a crowded 6-story timber building, you risk burning down the entire neighborhood, which happened constantly. But if you are a poor laborer and you don't have a kitchen, how do you feed your family?
You rely entirely on the ancient equivalent of carryout. The lower classes bought prepared, hot food from street vendors, pubs, and food stalls called thermopolia. They subsisted mostly on cheap bread, cereals, and a thick, filling type of wheat porridge called pulse.
But even buying street porridge requires a few copper coins. And if you have a massive population of tightly packed, impoverished, hungry people living in dark fire traps, you have the ultimate recipe for constant, explosive urban rioting. The emperor sitting in his palace knows this. A starving mob can overthrow the state. So the state implements one of the most famous and massive logistical policies in human history, the cura annone, or the grain dole.
It was an unprecedented state subsidy. To maintain urban peace, the government provided a free daily ration of grain to citizens who were legally registered for it in the city of Rome. At its peak, this covered roughly 200,000 to 250,000 adult males.
I sometimes hear people compare the annona to a modern universal basic income, but I think a better analogy is a massive, citizens-only municipal welfare system paid out entirely in raw calories.
That's a much more accurate way to frame it. It wasn't universal. You had to be a registered citizen of the capital. And the logistics required to execute this were staggering. Rome couldn't grow enough food in Italy to feed 1 million people. They had to import hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat, primarily from Egypt and North Africa. This required massive fleets of grain ships navigating the Mediterranean, huge artificial harbors at Ostia, and giant multi-story warehouses to store the grain without it rotting or being eaten by rats.
And later emperors realized grain wasn't enough, so they expanded it.
Yes, to keep the populace happy, later emperors added free distributions of olive oil, wine, and eventually even rations of pork. It cost the state at least 15% of its total annual revenues, but it was seen as absolutely non-negotiable. It physically affirmed the emperor's position as the universal provider, and most importantly, it kept the restless urban mob fed and relatively docile.
But reading the economic history here, what happens when that highly integrated system breaks down? Because a system relying on fleets of ships bringing grain from Egypt to feed 1 million people in Italy sounds incredibly fragile.
It was deeply vulnerable to economic shocks, and the biggest shock came from within. The entire Roman proto-capitalist network relied heavily on confidence in the currency. But remember, the emperor's power ultimately rests on the military. When emperors in the later dynasties, like the Severans, needed more and more money to pay the troops and secure their loyalty, they faced a problem. They couldn't easily raise taxes without angering the elites, so they started debasing the silver denarius.
Explain the mechanics of debasement. How did they actually do it?
They would take a silver coin, melt it down, and mix in cheaper base metals like copper or bronze, then mint a new coin that looked the same but contained less actual silver. Over decades, the silver content of the denarius plummeted from nearly pure silver down to less than 5%.
Wow, they were stealth printing money to cover their massive military deficits.
Precisely. And the economic law of inflation is ancient and undefeated. What happens when you rapidly expand the money supply with low-quality coins without actually expanding the real wealth of the empire? Sudden, massive, crippling inflation. Merchants aren't stupid. They realize the coins are increasingly worthless, so they demand more coins for the same loaf of bread.
I read that during the crisis of the 3rd century, this triggered a complete credit freeze.
It did. The supply of specie, meaning actual trustworthy precious metal coins, contracted sharply. People started hoarding old, pure silver coins. Because the currency was volatile, long-distance merchants lost trust. A merchant in Syria no longer wanted to sell his goods to Britain because the coins he would receive might be worthless by the time he got home. Long-distance trade broke down, the supply chains fractured, and the empire nearly collapsed.
So put yourself in the shoes of the emperor. The economy is shaky. Inflation is rising. You have hundreds of thousands of impoverished urbanites receiving free bread, living in terrible conditions, and because of the massive enslaved workforce doing the heavy labor, the urban poor actually have a fair amount of free time. Providing free calories isn't enough to stop them from realizing how miserable their lives are. You need to distract them. You need to occupy their minds. And that takes us to the most famous and infamous aspect of Rome. Let's talk about the spectacle.
The Roman satirist Juvenal famously and cynically complained that the Roman people had traded away their historical political liberty for two simple things: panem et circenses, bread and circuses, and the sheer scale of these circuses is difficult for a modern mind to fathom. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, up to 135 days a year were devoted to religious festivals, public holidays, and state-funded games.
Over a third of the year. Now, when we say Roman games, pop culture immediately jumps to the Colosseum, gladiators, and thumbs-down death matches. But the sources are very clear. The gladiators were not the main event. The true, unrivaled, fanatical obsession of ancient Rome was chariot racing.
Absolutely. The Colosseum held perhaps 50,000 people. The Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing track in Rome, held an estimated 150,000 to 250,000 spectators. It was the largest structure regularly built in the Roman world, and the racing was organized around highly commercialized professional factions known by the colors they wore: the reds, the whites, and predominantly the fierce rivals, the blues and the greens.
The fan loyalty described in these sources makes modern sports hooligans look incredibly tame. People rioted over these races.
The devotion was absolute and sometimes violent. Charioteers were the unquestioned superstars of antiquity. The most successful drivers, like a man named Diocles, accumulated prize money that made them among the wealthiest athletes in human history. But the sport was terrifyingly dangerous. The chariots were incredibly light, drawn by teams of 4 horses sprinting around tight corners. Collisions were frequent, spectacular, and exactly what the roaring crowd wanted to see. The Romans even had a specific word for a massive, multi-chariot crash: naufragia, which literally translates to shipwrecks.
But the craziest detail you find in the archaeological record isn't just the crashes, it's the psychological warfare of the fans. You have ordinary people literally burying magic curse tablets in the dirt of the racetrack to make rival teams crash.
Yes, the use of defixiones, or curse tablets. Chariot racing retained a sort of mystical aura from its very ancient roots in agricultural and religious rituals. Charioteers were often suspected by the public of practicing sorcery to win. Archaeologists have unearthed numerous lead tablets buried beneath the starting gates or along the track.
That's just wild.
Right. These tablets were inscribed with dark, chthonic spells meaning magic, calling upon the gods of the underworld. A fan of the blues would bury a tablet begging demons to physically bind the legs of the green faction's horses or to strike the rival driver blind so he would crash and die.
It's incredibly dark, but also hilariously relatable sports fanaticism, like, please let the opposing quarterback break his leg. But speaking of blood and death as entertainment, we have to address the gladiators, because this is another area where Hollywood has completely distorted the reality.
It has. The popular cinematic image is that every gladiator match was a chaotic brawl ending with the thumbs down and a brutal execution. But gladiators were highly skilled, extensively trained, and incredibly expensive professional combatants. They were an immense financial investment for the Lanista, the owner of the gladiator school. Their training took years, their specialized high-carbohydrate diet of barley and beans was strictly monitored, and they received some of the best medical and surgical care available in the ancient world.
Because they were high-value assets. They were basically the equivalent of modern, multi-million-dollar MMA fighters. You don't take your most expensive prize fighter and let him get slaughtered in a random Tuesday exhibition match.
Exactly. Death was not a necessary or even a desirable outcome in a standard match between two trained professionals. They fought under strict rules, with a referee in the arena. They fought to first blood, or until one gladiator was exhausted and submitted by raising a finger. If a gladiator fought bravely but lost, the crowd and the sponsor would almost always grant him a reprieve. The crowd appreciated the technical skill, the endurance, and the theater of the combat.
So if the gladiators aren't dying in droves, where does the reputation for Roman bloodlust come from?
It comes from the midday shows, because the real fatal brutality, the sheer unavoidable carnage, was reserved for a completely different class of people, the Noxvi.
The convicts.
Yes. The Noxis were convicted criminals, mutinous slaves, or prisoners of war. They had no training, no armor, and no expectation of survival. They were brought into the arena specifically to be executed. They were subjected to damnatio ad bestias, being torn apart by imported wild animals like lions or bears, or forced to fight each other to the death with blunt weapons.
And shockingly to our modern sensibilities, these executions weren't just a grim hanging. The Romans turned them into elaborate theatrical stage plays.
They staged them as fatal reenactments of Greco-Roman mythology. The amphitheaters were equipped with complex, hidden stage machinery, trapdoors, and painted scenery. If a myth involved a character flying too close to the sun and falling to his death, they would rig a convict up on a wire, heist him into the air, and drop him onto the sand. If a myth involved a hero being mauled by a bear, they would dress the convict in costume, tie him to a post, and literally release a starving bear from a trapdoor.
I have to push back here, or at least ask the question that anyone listening is screaming right now. Why? I mean, I understand the thrill of a chariot race. I can even understand the combat sport aspect of a professional gladiator duel. But sitting in a crowd, eating a snack, and watching an untrained human being get tortured and eaten by an animal as part of a stage play, how did a highly civilized society justify that?
It requires us to completely step outside our modern moral framework and understand the psychological utility of violence in Rome. To the Roman elite and to the crowd, the trained gladiator combat was a display of core Roman virtue. It demonstrated courage, martial discipline, and a noble contempt for death. It reinforced the military values that built the empire.
Oh, okay, I see that.
But the brutal execution of the Naxi served a completely different psychological purpose. It was seen as a vital restoration of moral order.
Public retributive justice.
Precisely. To the Roman mind, these convicts had broken the fundamental laws of society. By committing a severe crime, they had disrupted the peace. Therefore, their public suffering, humiliation, and destruction in the arena was the universe being put back into balance. It was a visceral, unforgettable public demonstration to the poorest, most desperate members of the audience. This is what happens when you cross the authority of Rome. It was ultimate control through ultimate spectacle.
The Roman spectacle wasn't entirely built on blood and dust. There was another massive component of daily urban life that was actually focused on hygiene, relaxation, and community. And that's the public baths.
The thermae. If the amphitheater was where Romans saw terrifying justice executed, the baths were where daily socialization and community actually happened. And it wasn't a luxury, because the vast majority of the population lived in those cramped, waterless insulae apartments we discussed. Communal bathing was an absolute hygienic necessity.
And once again, the engineering involved here is brilliant. Explain the mechanics of the hypocaust heating system.
The Romans essentially invented large-scale central heating. They built the floors of the bathhouses on small brick pillars, leaving an empty space underneath. Outside the building, slaves would constantly stoke massive wood furnaces. The blazing hot air and smoke from the furnaces would be drawn underneath the suspended floors and then up through hollow terracotta pipes hidden in the walls before venting out the roof.
So the floors and walls are literally radiating heat without any smoke entering the rooms.
Exactly. A Roman would progress through rooms of varying temperatures. You'd start in the tepidarium, a warm room to acclimate. Then you'd move to the coldarium, a blazing hot steam room where you would sweat profusely. You'd coat yourself in olive oil, and a slave or a friend would use a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape off the oil, sweat, and dirt. Finally, you would plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool to close your pores.
But it wasn't just a place to get clean. The massive imperial bath complexes had exercise yards, massage rooms, libraries, and food vendors.
It was the great social leveler and the political hub of the city. You strip away the expensive toga, you strip away the outward markers of class, and suddenly the wealthy senator and the newly wealthy freedman are sitting on the same marble bench in the steam room. Politicians would campaign in the baths, businessmen would strike deals. It was the daily communal heartbeat of Roman culture.
So you have this incredibly dense shared culture, the visceral spectacles, the communal baths, the bustling, dangerous cities, the standardized coins. But all of this infrastructure, all of this commerce is underpinned by how the Romans actually communicated and fundamentally how they understood their place in the universe. Which brings us to the final dimension of our deep dive. Let's talk about the mind and spirit of Rome, language, literacy, and the gods.
Communication is the invisible glue of any empire. But interestingly, unlike many modern nation-states that enforce a single official language, the Roman Empire was fundamentally a massive bilingual sphere.
It was split between Latin and Greek.
Broadly speaking, yes. Latin was the language of the West, the language of the military, and the language of the law. Greek was the language of the East, of philosophy, and of the educated elite. In fact, in the upper echelons of Roman society, fluency in Greek was a marker of high cultural status, while Latin was the pragmatic language of daily administration and career advancement. The emperors themselves and the Senate were entirely bilingual.
But what about the average person? The baker, the auxiliary soldier, the freedmen? Were they actually reading and writing, or was literacy strictly hoarded by the elite?
Literacy was surprisingly widespread among non-elites. Historians debate the exact numbers, but estimates suggest functional literacy range from 10% up to perhaps 30% in urban areas, which is astonishingly high for the ancient world. And we know this not just from surviving literature, but from the messy, physical evidence left behind by ordinary working-class people.
You're talking about the graffiti.
Yes. If you walk through the excavated ruins of Pompeii, the walls are completely covered in casual graffiti. We find political campaign slogans, insults between rival tavern owners, love notes, dirty jokes, and price lists. We find lead sling billets from battlefields with insults carved into them by soldiers. You simply do not have casual, messy, low-quality graffiti on tavern walls unless a significant portion of the working class has a functional grasp of reading and writing.
And the military kept an insane amount of written records.
The Roman military bureaucracy generated mountains of papyrus. We have surviving duty rosters, supply requests for grain and leather, personal letters from soldiers asking their families to send warmer socks. Basic numeracy and literacy were essential for the empire's commerce and administration to function.
But actually buying a book to read for pleasure was a different story entirely.
Because books were luxury items. For most of Roman history, a book was a volumen, a papyrus scroll. They were meticulously copied out by hand by educated slaves or scribes, making them very expensive and fragile. It wasn't until the end of the 3rd century AD that the bound book with pages, what we call the Codex, really started to gain popularity, largely driven by early Christians who wanted portable, easily cross-referenced texts.
So you have this widespread functional literacy, a bilingual elite, and a culture deeply rooted in written laws and contracts. But the law only applies to humans. How did the Romans deal with the divine? Because when you read the sources, Roman religion seems so completely alien, almost bureaucratic compared to how most people view religion today.
It feels alien because we live in a modern world that has been profoundly shaped by Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, which place a massive emphasis on inner belief, personal faith, moral dogma, and a personal relationship with the divine. Ancient Roman religion was fundamentally different. It was relentlessly practical, and it was contractual.
The defining phrase the sources use is doute,
which translates to, I give that you might give. Roman religion was an action-based insurance policy. It was not about what you believed in your heart. It was about the exact, meticulous, correct practice of prayer, ritual, and animal sacrifice. You offered a sacrifice to Jupiter or Mars, and in return, the gods protected your family, provided a good harvest, or ensured the legions won the next battle.
So I really want to nail this down. Their religion was essentially a legal contract with the gods. Like, I sacrifice this sheep to you, you give me a good harvest. There is no holy book, no dogma, and no moral purity tests required to enter a temple.
Exactly. It was all about maintaining the pax deorum, the peace or the goodwill of the gods. As long as you performed the public rituals correctly and paid the gods their due respect, what you personally believe in your own mind was largely irrelevant to the state. And because the religion was a practical contract rather than an exclusive truth, the Romans were incredibly syncretic as they expanded.
Syncretic meaning they eagerly absorbed other people's gods into their own system.
Yes, they believed the gods of other nations were real and powerful. So why eradicate a local god when you can just add them to your own divine insurance policy? When the Romans conquered Gaul, they would look at the local Celtic gods and say, your local god of thunder is just our god Jupiter appearing to you in a local form. They would build a temple and worship the Celtic god alongside the Roman gods. They enthusiastically imported the cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis and the Persian god Mithras, building temples to them right in the city of Rome.
It's an incredibly pragmatic way to build an empire. I mean, if you respect the local gods, the locals are much less likely to rebel. But this religious tolerance raises the massive historical elephant in the room. If the Romans were so tolerant, if they were perfectly happy to absorb every god they met, well, why did they famously persecute the early Christians?
That is the crucial question, and the answer goes right back to the Roman distinction between inner theology and state politics. The Roman authorities initially didn't care that Christians worshiped Jesus. They were fine with adding another god to the roster. What the Romans absolutely could not tolerate was the Christian claim that Jesus was the only God. And therefore, Christians absolutely refused to participate in the traditional state sacrifices or to bring a pinch of incense to honor the divine spirit of the emperor.
Because to a Roman, refusing to sacrifice isn't a theological disagreement, it's a breach of the state contract.
It is worse than a breach of contract. It is a threat to national security. The Romans truly believed that the success of the empire depended on maintaining the pax deorum. If a group of people living in the empire actively refuses to sacrifice to the gods of the state, they are angering the gods. If a plague hits the city, or if the harvest fails, or if a frontier army is massacred, the Romans believed it was because the gods were angry that these Christians weren't doing their civic duty to appease the heavens.
I see.
Therefore, to the Roman magistrate, forcing a Christian to sacrifice wasn't about saving their soul. It was about protecting the state. The Christian refusal was viewed as an act of political treason and civic sabotage.
That reframes the entire conflict. So the famous persecutions under emperors like Nero, Decius, and Diocletian, they were fundamentally political purges aimed at restoring public order and pleasing the traditional gods.
Yes, but it's important to note that for the first 2.5 centuries, the persecutions were largely sporadic, highly localized, and often driven by local mob violence rather than constant imperial policy. The most severe empire-wide persecution occurred under Diocletian at the very start of the 4th century. But by that point, the Christian network was deeply embedded across the empire. And then the ultimate paradigm shift occurs. In the early 4th century, Constantine the Great emerges as the first Roman emperor to officially convert to Christianity.
And he completely flips the script of the empire.
He does. He issues the Edict of Milan, granting full religious toleration. He begins funneling massive state funds into building churches, and eventually, under later emperors like Theodosius I, Christianity is declared the sole official state religion of the Roman Empire.
But the sources also point out a nuance here that often gets overlooked. Did Constantine immediately unleash the legions to slaughter all the pagans and tear down the ancient temples?
Interestingly, no. Constantine never engaged in a violent, bloody purge of the pagans. The shift was surprisingly gradual. People who hadn't converted remained in highly important positions at the imperial court and in the military. Public animal sacrifices were eventually banned, but other traditional, private pagan practices were tolerated for a surprisingly long time.
That is a really fascinating nuance.
It is. What is perhaps even more fascinating is the bureaucratic continuity of the Roman state. Once Christianity achieved complete political dominance, the later Christian emperors actually focused much more of their legal power and violent persecution on Christian heretics, meaning other Christians who practiced the wrong theological interpretation of the Trinity than they did on the dwindling pagan population. The massive state machinery of maintaining the correct relationship with the divine didn't disappear. It just smoothly changed its focus from enforcing polytheistic ritual to enforcing Christian orthodoxy.
Wow. Okay, looking at the time, we need to take a massive step back and look at the entire blueprint we've just laid out, because we have covered an immense continent-spanning amount of ground today.
We really have.
Let's summarize what we've discovered in these sources. We started by looking at a map of 5 million square kilometers, inhabited by up to 100 million people. We found an empire governed not by overwhelming brute force, but by a remarkably lean central government that survived by pragmatically franchising out power to local elites. We looked at a society that was dizzyingly, beautifully complex.
Yeah.
A society featuring massive upward social mobility, where women held real, legally protected financial power, and where former slaves could leverage their business acumen to become the wealthiest men in the city. We saw a highly integrated, monetized economy pumping standardized silver coins and goods across the Mediterranean, supported by a surprisingly literate working class.
But we also saw the shadow.
Right. We saw that this identical society was built firmly on a foundation of horrific institutionalized slavery. It featured staggering wealth inequality where the poor were crammed into dark, collapsing fire traps without kitchens, kept docile by a massive municipal welfare system of free calories. And it was a culture that found its ultimate moral validation in ritualized blood sports, watching untrained convicts get torn apart in elaborate theatrical reenactments to reinforce the authority of the state. Rome wasn't just a static collection of white marble statues, philosophical quotes, and a list of mad emperors. It was a functioning, highly adaptable, deeply pragmatic, and deeply flawed human system.
And like all complex systems, it eventually succumbed to the weight of its own internal logic. The Romans built their empire through brilliant cultural assimilation, vast technological scaling, and co-opting those local elites. But the system ultimately fractured under the weight of economic inflation caused by debased currency, the hoarding of vast wealth by the super-rich who increasingly use their influence to avoid paying taxes, and an over-reliance on a military made up almost entirely of the very outsiders they had assimilated.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Something for you, listening to this right now, to ponder long after this deep dive ends. Look at modern, highly globalized societies today. We look at Rome and we comfort ourselves by thinking of them as ancient history, safely trapped in the past. But when you look closely at our own stark wealth divides, at our incredibly fragile, highly integrated global supply chains that panic at the slightest disruption, at the wealthy navigating entirely separate tiers of justice, and at our own digital versions of bread and circuses relentlessly distracting us on our glowing screens, are we just looking at a mirror? Are we subconsciously repeating the exact same societal blueprint? Because when you look past the modern glass and steel of our societal skyscraper and you look deep into the foundation, the structural architecture of how human beings organize power, wealth, and distraction might be a lot older and a lot murkier than we want to admit. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.